Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story begins one fine day when many guests gathered on the street. There was a lot of different, very tasty and luxurious food around, and all these guests were drinking alcoholic drinks to relax. People were making small talk. Some men who were standing nearby were very surprised because they found it hard to believe that it could snow at such a time of year. Then they noticed all the snacks that were not covered in anything, and they realized that even the harvest in the gardens would simply be destroyed because of this climate. They also assumed that there would likely be more suicides at this time of year, and they were surprised that the aristocrats still decided to throw this party despite these weather conditions. The man who was one of the organizers of the party was the center of attention, but people were certainly not at all surprised that Lord Patrick would do something different. Some of the men suggested that their horse would probably be much smarter than this man, because they really thought it was inappropriate for such an event to take place at such a time. However, when they looked away, they saw that Ethiopia itself had come to the event, and they were indeed very surprised to see her. In fact, this girl was Patrick's fiancée, and she approached these men and said that, as they had said, she would tell Patrick to refrain from unnecessary expenses. The men didn't respond to this, they just bowed and greeted her out of politeness. Afterwards, this Ethiopia just passed forward. When she had gone far enough, one of the nobles said that he was relieved that she had received the education of a queen. However, they were surprised that she was standing next to this homeless crown prince, wasting her time like this. His friend agreed with him and said that it was indeed unexpected. However, many called her an ice maiden, and that is why they thought it was even a little right that someone like her was next to the very hot-tempered Patrick. In fact, in that world there was a special savior who brought warmth to the frozen land, and she was called the Fiery Saint. Many people idolized this one woman. In the Ethiopian family, the Kalitas were born for generations in the role of fiery saints. However, despite her direct descent, the girl did not have enough of this luck. Of course, she received the power of a saint, but not in the form that everyone expected to see her. The head of the family, her grandfather, ordered the girl to become a queen who would support the crown prince, and she had to do it, even though she knew perfectly well that she did not want such a life. However, she received an education as if she were a queen and suppressed all the emotions that arose in a girl. Ethiopia has learned to deal quite calmly with absolutely any situation in which she was treated badly, talked about behind her back, or told what she thought to her face. She had to become someone worthy so that she could be near the king. Even though Patrick was a rather irresponsible person, she had to have a high status. And that is why soon the Ice Maiden became her nickname. Absolutely everyone around her began to call her that. So even now, when she is bullied, it does not bother her at all. She learned indifference when she was studying to be a queen, so it has been very useful to her in life. Her heart does not react at all to such humiliations. She does not care at all what and who says about her. As Ethiopia began to approach her fiancé, she suddenly heard someone speaking to her. It was a young girl, who told her that she would not allow such words to be spoken. When Ethiopia turned to the side, she saw Beatrice. She immediately recognized her voice but greeted her. This girl was quite popular in high society. Many people immediately crowded around her. They said that they heard that Beatrice hunted a magical beast last night, and they really admired it. They praised her and simply idolized this girl, who really was very beautiful and attractive. In fact, Beatrice was the child of Ethiopia's stepmother, and therefore her half-sister. People called this girl the Fiery Saint Beatrice, and all because she had magical abilities that were quite strong, even despite her young age. In fact, this young girl traveled the lands and killed magical beasts, thereby saving those who died from injuries and diseases and preventing future tragedies. Everyone around her considered Beatrice incredibly kind, intelligent, gentle, and beautiful. She was the very image of a saint, thanks to which people understood what they wanted to see. There was even a time when Ethiopia was a little jealous of her half-sister, because she had a lot of attention and recognition from people, while she herself ended up getting nothing. Of course, all this was in her distant childhood, when Ethiopia had a rather weak gift, but she could still create a small fire. One day, the girl saw Beatrice use her magical abilities, create a whole flame around herself, and was very surprised by her abilities. Of course, as soon as Mother Beatrice saw this, she immediately ran up to her. She began to praise her, hug her, and say that she was a great girl who was able to do this. And Ethiopia at that moment simply stood aside, like a forgotten person, and watched how joyfully they behaved. Of course, it was incredibly offensive for her then, However, now she was Patrick's fiancée and she had no one else to envy. The girl worked on her self-esteem and now no longer paid attention even to her half-sister. At this point, the conversation was suddenly interrupted by the instigator of this event. Patrick stood on the table, addressing everyone. He held a glass of wine in his hands and asked how their time of entertainment was going. He was already quite drunk, which is why he could not even stand on his feet. As soon as people saw Crown Prince Patrick, they were immediately very surprised that he was behaving in such an inappropriate manner. However, of course, nothing was said about it. Ethiopia stood nearby at the time and just watched what was happening with a smile. She understood that he was worried like a child, and it was visible on him. In fact, many people called Patrick a romantic, believing that he does not know much about this world and lives in his rose-colored glasses, thinking that everything around him is wonderful. However, it was precisely because of his boundless righteousness that this country was saved. From the moment Ethiopia became his wife, she had to support Patrick in everything so that he would not despair and give up. The man, having finished his speech, raised his glass and glanced briefly at his future wife. As soon as their eyes met, Patrick began to get up from his seat and come closer to the girl. He stated that he wanted to introduce everyone to his most beloved bride and the person he cherished the most. People around were extremely surprised. They did not expect such a statement, but Ethiopia, having foreseen this, remained calm. She laughed awkwardly and came closer to him. Her face turned a little red and people continued to whisper as they could not believe that this was true. However, when Patrick asked her to come closer, Ethiopia suddenly stopped, noticing Beatrice heading towards him. Ethiopia continued to smile, but inside her there was a whirlwind of emotions that she could not show. She was incredibly shocked by what was happening and could not believe that Beatrice had done this to her. Meanwhile, Patrick hugged Beatrice and said with a smile that she was now his favorite bride, and he was glad that she was present at the event. Ethiopia stood as if struck by lightning, not understanding what this meant. She even thought that she had missed some important letter. People began to whisper, and the men smiled awkwardly, asking His Highness to stop joking because it was not serious. One of his friends clarified that his bride is Ethiopia because everyone knows this. However, Patrick stated that this was true until last week, but now everything has changed. He kissed Beatrice on the hand and said in a calm voice that he had been waiting for a long time to be with her, his little kitty, who would now be next to him. He then turned to the aristocrats present at the event and asked them to be witnesses as he formally announced his engagement to Beatrice. He said that they were in love and he wanted to capture this moment forever. Ethiopia stood rooted to the spot, her eyes wide, stunned and unable to control her expression. Beatrice glanced at her, beaming with happiness, enjoying her victory. She then turned her attention to Patrick and giggled. Ethiopia, who remained in the crowd, realized that she had now been abandoned, and in a very humiliating way. After some time, the event ended and Ethiopia returned to her estate. When all the evening procedures were done, she simply stood by the window and, looking out, thought about why the hell Patrick started to like this Beatrice. Yes, of course. This girl was charming, and absolutely everyone loved her and doted on her. However, she thought that he was not like that. Also, Ethiopia didn't understand since when he was going to keep such big secrets from her. And besides, how could he choose her half-sister? Looking out the window, she saw that the girl had also arrived from the event and was going home. Ethiopia tried to calm down, because she understood that she did not need to indulge in such strong emotions once again. She began to mentally calculate various numbers in order to calm down. In fact, this had been her technique for a long time. She added up various numbers, thereby distracting her brain from obsessive thoughts. She spoke to herself and said that she needed to remain calm and balanced. The girl also used breathing exercises, which always helped her. However, at that moment she suddenly heard a knock on the door and the voice of Beatrice, who, opening it slightly, asked if she could come in. Ethiopia managed to smile and put a mask on her face. She said that she was very happy to welcome her back and was quite welcoming and friendly towards her. Of course, Beatrice was very surprised when she saw her so calm. But the girl also felt guilty, so she didn't just stand on the threshold. She ran to her sister and immediately began to ask her for forgiveness, saying that she had absolutely no intention of stealing Patrick from her and that it all happened completely by accident. Beatrice began to apologize to her and said that such a thing should never happen again. She brought up various arguments, but Ethiopia practically did not listen to her. But of course the girl didn't want to listen to all this because she knew that it was all just words. So she looked at her sister and said that he had left her, and that was all. She didn't need to know more. As soon as Beatrice heard this, she looked at her with her beautiful big eyes, and then she suddenly laughed and said that Ethiopia must really be the Ice Queen. Ethiopia smiled tenderly and said that it was indeed so. Beatrice, meanwhile, was incredibly happy and said that in that case she could be at ease with life in the north. But the girl, hearing about this, was really surprised because she had never heard anything like this before. She came closer to her sister and asked, "What kind of life is there in the north?" At this point, Beatrice realized that this was simply terrible and asked, "Doesn't she know anything?" But immediately explained that a bride to replace her had already been chosen. Ethiopia calmed down a little and immediately asked what it meant, a replacement bride. However, the girl said that they really found a groom for her, and it was Terabard Dimker. Ethiopia immediately asked, "Is this really the same Sad Devil Duke?" And the girl said that, unfortunately, this is true. She really didn't know that no one had told Ethiopia about this, so she even felt a little uncomfortable about it. In fact, the North protected the Holy Capital from magical beasts, and the fall of the Holy Capital was only a matter of time, as many said. Therefore, people were afraid to go there. The magical beasts grew much stronger every day, and they devoured even the warmth of the fireplaces, not to mention the warmth of the human body. In the North, everyone was freezing. There was no sun, no warmth, and that was why the whole world was just freezing little by little. Azerbate was actually a young ruler of the North, and he was surrounded by some pretty terrible and dangerous rumors. In fact, people were saying that he might be a servant of evil, a real minion of the devil. Beatrice told Ethiopia that she was the one given the mission to investigate this man up close, pretending to be his fiancé. They were both silent for a while, and then the girl asked if she really meant that she should become his wife, keep an eye on him, and then send information to the Holy Capital so that they would know what was going on. Beatrice smiled happily, applauded, and said that it was exactly like that. She liked the fact that the girl understood everything so quickly, but she should not have expected anything else. Ethiopia wasn't as happy as her sister. She covered it all up with sweet words that it would be a special mission for her. But in reality, the girl understood that she was simply rejected under a convenient offer for herself, and the girl could no longer continue to watch Patrick. Now she would go to a completely different place, even a dangerous one, and would be forced to be there. It is also used to lure out information, and this can all be incredibly dangerous. But at that moment, she suddenly remembered how Beatrice had taken her fiancé's hand and all that tenderness, and she realized that she no longer wanted to watch his life or her sister's. Ethiopia never really wanted to experience the feelings she had inside when she saw those two happy people again in her life. She sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. After that, she smiled a little and told Beatrice to leave it all to her, and also that she, in turn, protect the Holy Capital. Beatrice, hearing all about it, immediately became happy and applauded. She was even ready to hug her sister, but she thought that it would be a bit too much. Of course, Ethiopia absolutely hated all of this, but she still had to put on a good face, even in this terrible time when her whole life was going wrong, and she just couldn't do anything about it. As soon as Beatrice heard these words, she beamed with joy and asked her sister if she had really forgiven them for all this. However, when the girl heard this suggestion, she was simply horrified because she could never forgive these people. However, she knew that her sister had to focus on saving people as a special saint, and someone like her simply couldn't get in her way. So Ethiopia kissed her on the forehead and said that of course she didn't have to worry about it at all. She forgave them and put it all behind her. Beatrice immediately hugged her and was ready to jump for joy. She said that she loved her sister incredibly much and was very grateful to her for such kind words. Then moving closer to her, she also said that since they were already talking so frankly, Beatrice decided to give in, that there was a child inside her belly. As soon as Ethiopia heard this, she was so surprised that her heart broke into little pieces. She certainly did not expect to hear this from her younger sister, and she guessed perfectly well that this child was most likely Patrick's. Her sister, after a short silence, stepped back and said that she had only recently found out that she now had a child. Of course, she knew perfectly well that all this was wrong, because they hadn't even exchanged wedding vows. However, she couldn't just terminate this pregnancy. It was now a part of her life. Ethiopia, meanwhile, continued to use her techniques in the hope that she would be able to calm down. However, it did not work because the news had taken her by surprise. For a while, Beatrice just sat in silence. Then, looking at her watch, she said that it was already quite late and it was time for her to leave. She also suggested discussing this issue another day so that everyone would be calm and could think it over thoroughly. Of course, Ethiopia did not object. Then the girl, before leaving, smiled and thanked her for listening and supporting her. After that, she closed the door and left. And at that moment, when the girl was left alone in her dark room, she was finally able to give vent to the feelings that had accumulated inside her. Ethiopia sat with her head down and cried loudly, not understanding how Patrick could do this to her, because he had never even kissed her. But now he had a child with Beatrice. Meanwhile, her sister, having closed the door, remained standing there. She heard the sobbing that came from the other side, and she understood perfectly well that she had hurt her. However, the girl smiled ominously and thought that she was really very sorry. However, she should just disappear to the edge of the earth so that everyone would simply forget about her, and no one would think about her anymore. Some time passed since then, and Ethiopia was indeed sent north. She had been traveling for several weeks, and at last they reached the snow rapids. The girl was riding in a carriage with her maid. Of course, she was dressed very warmly, but even despite this, she was still cold. In fact, it was a little difficult for Ethiopia to be in this place because it was in the north that the castle where her father died was located. She made it her goal to never go back there again because it was traumatic for her. However, she believed that if it could help save lives and the world, she couldn't just stand aside from it. However, Ethiopia also hoped that if spring one day filled this world, then she too would hope that she too could find a place in it, and that she would not simply be driven out of it. While they were riding in the carriage, and Ethiopia was thinking about all this, it was calm. But then suddenly she began to shake violently, and the maid, frightened, began to scream loudly. Ethiopia immediately ran to the window and asked what was going on. However, at that moment the carriage stopped completely and the doors opened. Then Patrick appeared right in front of them on the threshold. He smiled and said that he was very glad that he had managed to come on time. Ethiopia looked at him with incredible surprise and asked what he was doing in this place, because they were already very far from home. The man was silent for a while, after which he said that he just wanted to apologize to her, because he really felt guilty. The man bowed low and asked her forgiveness, saying that he could not bear the thought that he had caused her so much pain. Ethiopia didn't take it seriously. She just assumed he was probably hungover. That's why he came running to her and started apologizing, and he was holding his head, and she assumed that was probably it. However, Patrick spoke sincerely. He even had tears in his eyes, and he said that he did not want to hurt her. He was just too drunk yesterday, and that is why he did not think about how he was making her out to be in this situation. In fact, Ethiopia had many things she wanted to know up until that point. However, the girl remained silent and only asked if it was true that their engagement was already called off. Patrick was very surprised when he heard this, but he looked at her and asked, "Can she really take it so calmly?" After all, he let her down and humiliated her right in front of many people. Of course, the girl couldn't accept all this so easily, but she said that it didn't matter to her at all what she would say to the crown prince, because her words had no meaning. But Patrick persisted. He said he didn't like it. If the disaster hadn't happened, he didn't think he would have broken off the engagement at all. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very surprised and asked, "Does he really want to tell her now that he fell in love with Beatrice only because of the disaster?" Patrick said that this was true. However, her future groom refused him and said that he would not marry anyone but her. Ethiopia, hearing about this, was very surprised and asked what he meant, because she did not understand how this was possible. But the man explained that the holy capital wanted to send ordinary spies to the north, so they gathered the daughters of prestigious families and made him a tempting offer. However, this man turned out to be quite picky and said that he would not agree unless it was Ethiopia, so they simply had no choice. Patrick explained that he simply had to give in and abandon the girl because otherwise the whole operation would have failed. As soon as she heard all this, she was really shocked. Of course, she could not have expected such a turn of events. But at the same time, she was very pleased by the fact that Patrick meant that he still loved her. And if it weren't for this stupid situation, they would be together. The man looked at her with tears in his eyes and said that in society, he did not want to let her go, but he simply could not do anything about it. Ethiopia at this point began to think things over carefully and realized that their deep connection was broken only because of some stupid policy. However, at that moment she realized that this was not the case, and all because Beatrice was now carrying Patrick's child inside her, and this would never have happened between them anyway. There was silence in the carriage for a while. Then the man, sighing heavily, said that he would miss her incredibly, and simply did not know how to live on. At that moment, she thought that all these words were untrue. She doubted very much that he would regret or blame himself. He would simply continue to live as he had, even forgetting about her. Of course, she gave him almost her whole soul, and in the end received such a terrible answer in her direction. But before leaving, Patrick extended his hand forward and said that he would be incredibly eagerly awaiting her letter from the north. Shaking her hand, he said that of course her hidden activities would be known to them, since she was going there anyway. She had to go to Svetl's treasures and find out everything there. Ethiopia suddenly asked, "Does he really mean those very treasures of light, namely the jewels that are even called a miracle?" The man said that this is exactly what he meant. In fact, these were indeed mysterious stones that increased the power of the one who possessed them. Ethiopia had heard dark rumors about how exactly these jewels were made. Many spoke of torturing kidnapped girls there and sealing their souls in just such stones, or that they made deals with magical beasts in order to ultimately obtain these jewels. Ethiopia knew that when they made a deal with the beasts, they were exchanging their hearts in order to have the ability to control the colored treasures. In fact, the North was destroyed 15 years ago. However, it was reborn precisely thanks to these very treasures of Svetl. Of course, the girl could assume that it was somehow connected with magical beasts. However, she did not know for sure. Before leaving, Patrick said that there were special informants there, on the spot, and they would definitely help her. At first, he said that one of them was called Saria. Ethiopia, after listening to him attentively, simply said in a cold voice that she understood everything, because she was not going to develop this topic with him any further. This man was unpleasant to her. After that, the girl continued her journey. In fact, she heard various stories in which magical beasts and people could communicate. She also thought that if Zerbard had such an ability, then she would need to find out what his goal was. The girl was silent for a while, then turned to her maid and asked if they had heard any rumors about the North. The maid immediately replied that, of course, she had heard a lot of them. And then she told me that there were rumors that the castle was haunted and that its owner was a real murderer and that many missing people were missing there. Ethiopia, hearing all this, reacted quite calmly. She just sat and smiled, but she herself understood that these rumors could be completely false. The maid looked very worried at this point and said that she was worried whether she would be able to stay there at all and help the girl if something happened. Ethiopia replied that she understood everything because she had exactly the same feelings. She did not know what was waiting for them ahead, so there was some fear. At this point, the maid asked in surprise, "Is that really so?" And also asked if she knew correctly that the mistress had already been to the north before. Ethiopia did not hide all this. From her bed, she said that it was indeed so. However, she does not remember anything at all because it was 15 years ago. She also wondered why Jezelbert suddenly decided to marry someone like her. And besides, she remembered Patrick's reaction. She was a little surprised by it. Yes, I remembered that the man refused Patrick's mutual proposal and even insisted that he wanted to marry Ethiopia. The girl thought that if he really was a servant of the magical beasts, then it could mean that she would be safe because she did not have such a great power of the saint. Or perhaps she assumed that he simply wanted to take advantage of the huge amount of money from the holy capital in order to use it for some of his own needs. And the girl also spent almost the entire journey thinking about what this man looked like, because she had never met him in person, and rumors described him as disgusting. By the time the holy capital sent her north, the girl believed that it was probably already dark. However, it was a little surprising to her to hear the fact that this person could be someone who actually loved her in some way. Ethiopia didn't understand how this was even possible, but she decided to accept the situation as it was and realized that it was best for her to just forget Patrick and move on. After all, she would definitely never be able to go back to him. Now he would have a child. And besides, the time she had spent on this man could never be returned. So Ethiopia suggested that she should just let go of all these regrets and move on with her life. Then suddenly the maid looked out the window and said in a joyful voice that she finally saw the castle. The girl immediately looked to the side to see it. However, as soon as Ethiopia saw this castle, which was located in a snowy valley, she immediately felt very creepy about it. Memories of her father quickly began to surface in her mind. She immediately felt the same terrible feelings she had felt when he died. Because of this, Ethiopia even felt a little sick. She couldn't breathe. However, at that moment, their carriage suddenly began to shake very violently, and the maid was incredibly surprised by this. She shouted to the group, asking what was going on. At that moment, a knight appeared in front of them and said that he would check everything. They just had to wait a little bit. The maid was very scared. She already thought that they were attacked by magical beasts, but Ethiopia tried to calm her down, saying that they definitely shouldn't panic now. They just need to wait until the knight returns and tells them everything. The girls sat in silence for a while, but then suddenly their carriage overturned and they fell straight into the cold snow. They screamed loudly, but Ethiopia managed to turn over so that she was now covering the maid with her body, who was incredibly afraid of all this. They lay motionless for a while. Then the girl tried to look around, but she couldn't see anything because of the heavy snowfall. Ethiopia also felt that a little more and she would completely lose consciousness due to the shock that happened, but the girl tried not to give in. However, at that moment, she suddenly heard some strange sounds nearby, and when she sat up lifting the maid and looked away, she was simply horrified. Ethiopia was about to scream, but she held back. She saw a truly horrific picture, a huge ice dragon devouring their coachman alive. After that, she noticed that the sword that the knight was holding in his hands had flown some distance to the side, and she tried to come up with a plan of action. The girls were incredibly shocked by what had happened and did not know what to do next. Another knight who accompanied them simply mounted his horse and rode away from there, not even paying attention to the girls who continued to sit and scream. Ethiopia tried to stop him, but it was no use. The man was not going to risk his life for the two of them. The maid, meanwhile, tried to jump back and said that this monster would eat them now because he was already distracted from the dead knight. The maid's instinct for self-preservation kicked in, so she threw her mistress aside and began to run away, saving her life. When Ethiopia looked away, she saw that this ice dragon was already approaching her with its mouth open, ready to kill her mercilessly. The girl was simply stunned. She sat in the cold snow and did not know what she was supposed to do in such a situation. She was simply confused. Her hands were shaking very badly. She understood that she simply did not have time to think for long. So the girl stood up and ran to the sword that was located nearby. Reaching him in time, she grabbed the sword, and when the dragon began to swim past her, she struck him straight in the back. After that, the girl turned around and made another blow, but she did not have time to do this, because the dragon simply grabbed her sword with its huge teeth. Ethiopia didn't even have time to understand how it happened. However, the dragon, hitting her with its huge tail, knocked her off her feet, and the sword flew out of her hands. Because the girl couldn't dodge, she fell to the ground. There was blood around her due to the strong blow. Ethiopia lay motionless. She couldn't do anything because she was already on the verge of losing consciousness. Her whole body was numb, and she just lay there and watched this dragon approach. The girl also thought that if she had to die that day, she just needed to congratulate him. Because even after losing her fiancé, the Ice Princess, as everyone said, did not lose her head. The girl still kept her face as it should be. She was happy for her sister and understood that she had been proud all this time, as it should be. And just when Ethiopia thought that death had already come, a knight appeared out of nowhere and killed the dragon with his huge sword. The girl immediately looked up and was very surprised. She looked at this knight in uniform and the others who had already approached and could not understand who had suddenly decided to save her. But looking more closely, the girl thought that it was most likely the gloomy priest who came to her aid. However, this was quite surprising. She knew that with all the stress and the strong blow to her head, she couldn't be conscious anymore, but she also knew that if she passed out now, anything could happen. No matter how hard Ethiopia tried, she could not maintain her consciousness for long, and she soon simply fell asleep. The knight who saved her took off his mask from his face, and coming closer to her, took the girl in his arms. He did not intend to do anything bad to her, but on the contrary, he wanted to save her so that she would not freeze to death. Several hours had passed since then. In a manor in the north, two men were sitting in a study, arguing over a very important matter. There was a guy there with bright red hair. He was a first-class private assistant to the Cares. There was also another guy sitting there who was also a person from the first class, Private Linus, Saren, and he was just in a panic. The man was sitting there shaking all over. He was talking about how bad it was. Linus turned to his friend and asked how he would make a living from tomorrow onwards, and also said that he would definitely be fired that day because of such an incident, since it was not the first time. But his friend cheerfully asked him why he thought that at all, since nothing had been decided yet, and he was already so upset. But Linus replied that Ethiopia was actually the fiancé of a very important man, and she had been wounded in his sensitive area, and that was why he knew perfectly well that he was in trouble. He even thought that he would be pierced by the Demon King's double-pointed spear even if he apologized. In fact, the Demon King in that area was called Zerberd, who was Ethiopia's fiancé, but his friend still did not understand why he was panicking so much and immediately asked him why he thought so. This made the guy even more angry. He started yelling at him and asked, had he really not listened to him at all this time? But the man calmly replied that there were almost no knights left, so the Demon King would definitely not be able to fire him. He really needed people who could fight the beasts. Len agreed with him, and his friend also replied that the whereabouts of the 4 missing knights were still unknown. After that, he raised his voice and told him to stop whining and get ready. However, the guy replied that it was a document that said there was a clue about their location, and he had only recently seen it. Len also said that the same thing applies to his friend's brother. If he were found, it would be great, because he was probably the one who was with the missing knights, so there was still hope. Zerberd just entered the room, asking whether they had already prepared the report. Len was immediately so scared that he was ready to scream, but he managed to control his emotions, stood up to greet the man, and really hoped that the man would not be so angry and would not kill him. However, Zerberd completely ignored him, and moving closer to the work table, he addressed his assistant, holding out his hand. The man demanded a report. Cairo immediately said that everything was ready, so he handed him a piece of paper with a letter. The man immediately took it and began to study it carefully. Zerberd had quite a handsome appearance. He had dark, raven-like hair and incredibly beautiful blue eyes with a violet tint. As soon as the guy read everything, he started to leave and said that they had worked well, so now they could go and rest in peace. His 2 assistants immediately bowed and thanked him for this. However, Len turned to the man and asked if everything was all right with his bride, because they were really very worried. But the guy didn't answer. He simply left and closed the door behind him, not considering it necessary to continue this conversation. While Ethiopia was unconscious, she had a lot of memories in her head. The first thing that came to mind was when she was little, and Beatrice first showed her greatest abilities, and she couldn't do it. Then her father came up to her and said that everything was absolutely fine, and also suggested that she try again, because he believed that this time she could succeed. However, Ethiopia then burst into tears because she did not believe in herself and said that there was no point in even trying because she would never be able to do it like Beatrice. Her father was an incredibly kind man. He smiled and said that this was completely normal because all people are different and everyone has their own measure of ability. The girl didn't want to repeat it again. However, she had no choice because she also didn't want to disappoint her father, so Ethiopia activated her abilities again. The man who stood next to her said that she got a beautiful color from this fire. It looked like a jewel. He also said that it was the color that would always warm people's hearts, even in the coldest time. As soon as Ethiopia heard these words, she was incredibly happy. She was always happy when her father complimented her and praised her. In fact, her real mother died immediately after giving birth to Ethiopia, and her father was the eldest son of the Callard family, which produced saints and was next in line. Ethiopia was certainly his daughter, who did not display the power of the saint that everyone expected. So many were disappointed in her. The girl's grandfather, Count Kellard, would never have allowed a number of saints to disappear from the family, so he even went to some unpleasant things for him. One day, the girl's grandfather brought home a little girl and her mother. It was a child of low status, but with incredible abilities and great powers, and that child was Beatrice. Ethiopia's father and Beatrice's mother eventually got married because her grandfather said so, and so the girl got herself a new family. However, everything was no longer the same as before. Beatrice truly had incredible abilities, and her holy power protected the Keller family's status. Of course, their family could have succumbed to all sorts of quarrels and discord, but this did not happen because they supported each other. At least, that's what Ethiopia thought. But now she wasn't so sure about Beatrice. She didn't know her sister for sure, and she didn't understand what the girl's motives were. After some time, she finally woke up and realized that she felt warm. This immediately surprised her, because her last memories reminded her that she was in the snow. The girl also remembered very well that she had been attacked by a monster. However, now she was lying in a warm room in a soft bed. Then suddenly Ethiopia heard some sound made by a man. She looked to the side and saw the man sitting next to her. He smiled and asked, "Is she really not dead?" As soon as Ethiopia saw him, she immediately frowned. She didn't know who this man was, and when she wanted to ask, he interrupted her. The man remained in his place and quickly began to approach her, asking, Does she really want to know who he is? He came closer and closer to her, and also asked what she was doing with such a dangerous creature, all alone. The girl understood perfectly well that this could be dangerous, so she was not going to answer his question and asked anyway, "Who is he?" But the guy who was Zerbert asked, "Who knows for sure?" and also asked her what she thought he was. Ethiopia thought for a while, and then she remembered that before she lost consciousness, she saw the knight and his minions. So with a clear confidence in her voice, she said that he might be a dark priest. But the guy, as soon as he heard this suggestion, could not hold back his emotions and laughed loudly. For a moment he could not calm down and said that this was a rather good assumption. As for her, the poor princess, who had lived all her life in the shadow of her sister and who was now in mortal danger, he looked her straight in the eyes and asked if she thought it necessary to figure out for herself who he really was, since her version with the priest was wrong. Ethiopia was silent for a while, then asked, "What is his goal anyway? Why did he save her? Does he want to rob her or kidnap her just to get his ransom?" She really didn't understand his intentions. Zerbert stood there silently for a while, after which the girl said that if he behaved like this despite knowing who she really was, then he was in danger of losing even his own life. Therefore, Ethiopia dared to assume that even if he killed her, the holy city would find her and take revenge on him. But the girl didn't have time to finish her sentence. She immediately understood something, and so she fell silent. Zerbert was very surprised by her sudden silence, and turning to the girl in an alarmed voice asked, "Why did she stop talking at all?" In fact, Ethiopia at that moment thought that if she had to be expelled from the world of Patrick and Beatrice, then her death would be an incredibly convenient opportunity for both of them. The man at that moment came closer to her, and Ethiopia asked in a rough voice, "What is he going to do with her?" Because she really was interested. They looked into each other's eyes for a while, but remained silent. Zerbert was thinking about his plan of action and how he should act in this situation. After that, he moved away from the girl and asked if her performance was over yet. After all, it turned out to be even more interesting than the operas he had once attended, so he even applauded her. The girl felt bad that he was treating her like that, with absolutely no respect or understanding for her situation. But she still turned to him and said that she did not mind if he killed her, and also finally looked him straight in the eyes. She asked if he was from the Holy City. Zerbert was very surprised. However, he smiled and asked what she was saying. Was she really calling him a murderer now, even though she had previously considered him a robber? Ethiopia looked him straight in the eye and said that it was indeed true. He was an assassin sent to get rid of her. That was exactly how she felt about the whole situation. There was complete silence in the room for a while. Zerbert was thinking about what to do, and finally he gave his name. As soon as Ethiopia heard this, she was genuinely surprised. She looked at him with huge eyes and did not understand what he meant. However, the man explained that this was his name, and at that moment Ethiopia really did not expect such a turn of events. She thought that he was hired to kill her, but she certainly did not know that he was her new fiancé. She asked in a trembling voice if he was really telling the truth, because she didn't believe it, but the man mockingly asked if she really had any doubts about whether he was telling the truth. But Ethiopia didn't have time to answer because he spoke first, and said that he was surprised that she didn't try to fight using fire, and she didn't use magic even when she was attacked. Zerbert worriedly asked if she had any special reason for this. After a short silence, the girl explained to him that she was a little different from her sister. With her head down, she also said that she had absolutely no ability in fire magic, so what he got was completely different from what he expected. Zerbert meanwhile took his spear, which was standing nearby, and said that he did not need a fake. After that, he ran towards her with crazy eyes and said that he was already tired of listening to her. At that moment, the blade was a centimeter away from the girl's throat, and she just looked at it in surprise and also didn't try to resist. He continued to hold the gun near her throat and said in a quiet voice that he had not been able to sleep enough, and that this terrible conversation had become boring to him. So he felt that he needed to end it quickly before he fell asleep from boredom or even died. At that moment, Ethiopia looked at him in surprise and asked in a trembling voice if he really thought she was lying to him when she said those words. The man continued to hold the gun and said that this was exactly it. He believed that she was just a fake Ethiopia killer and was now trying to make him believe her. Of course, the girl knew perfectly well that she was not a fake. She was the real thing. But she didn't know how to prove it to him. Clenching her fist, the girl said that she was indeed Ethiopia Kelleth, and she had lived her entire life wanting to end it. The girl also said that if she could become someone else, she would gladly want to give up the life she had now. She didn't like it at all, and she would give everything just to get rid of it. The man was very angry about this conversation and told her to stop talking to herself because he was busy. He also said that she should have known about the monster attacks. Zerbird replied that in just 48 hours, more than 20 monsters had appeared in the city, and the frequency of their appearance was simply unbelievable. The whole situation was unbelievable to him, and of course, they sent all their forces there, but it was not enough. Ethiopia didn't respond to this. She just stood there and looked at him with tears in her eyes. Of course, she knew that it was even worse than she had been told. The holy city would really just drown in these monsters, and people couldn't do anything, even with great abilities and strength. The man said that if he had the opportunity, he would also like to communicate with girls. However, he can't afford it because he spends almost all his time on the battlefield. He also said that he thinks she is a spy. With a voice trembling with hurt and fear, Ethiopia said that she was not a spy at all. She gave her name and replied that it was not a lie at all. Zerbird was incredibly irritated by this whole situation. He finally put away his spear and, moving closer to her, said that she was an incredibly stubborn girl. He whispered that he would hug her and asked if he remembered correctly that she had said that she worked in the holy city. He laid Ethiopia down on the bed, but still continued to talk to her. The man asked if she was planning to stab him in the back and again called the girl a spy, because he knew perfectly well that he could not trust anyone. The girl, meanwhile, simply lay there and looked him straight in the eyes. She knew that all this was madness, but if it was necessary, then she had to play along. Zerbird continued to speak. He said that he was very sorry, but she certainly could not kill him, because if she moved her hands unnecessarily, he would do it first. Ethiopia was a little scared at that moment, but she understood that this was her only good chance to find out about his sincere intentions. She had to hurry a little and get her job done as quickly as possible, and then return to the holy city and forget about all this. At this point, the man began to untie the strings on the girl's dress and, continuing to speak in a quiet voice, said that he would make her feel good if she behaved well and obediently. He kept calling her a spy, after which he tied her hands so that she would definitely not be able to kill him. And Ethiopia knew that this would not end well. Then he began to slowly kiss the girl on the neck and told her to return to the holy city tomorrow, only to tell her that the assassination had failed. The girl, meanwhile, tried to wave her arms vigorously. She began to have magical energy in the form of sparks, but the fire did not ignite. The girl was already in despair and thought that everything was as she knew it was impossible. However, at that moment, the fire suddenly intensified, and it even spread to Zerbird's hands. The man was incredibly scared. He didn't understand what was happening for a while, but he immediately jumped away from the girl and started to put out his hand because it was too hot. Ethiopia, at that moment, you yourself were very surprised. The man then shouted at her, asking what she was doing. The girl sat up on the bed and replied that it was not her at all. It had nothing to do with it. He actually had imprints all over his hands, and he screamed at her, asking who could have done this, since there was no one else in the room except the two of them. He activated his own cold magic abilities and finally put out the fire on his hand. Zerbord continued to yell at her and said that she was the one who set it on fire and that she couldn't lie to him or it would only get worse. In fact, Ethiopia was very hesitant. She did not know what to do, but she knew one thing. She just needed to flee immediately, while she had such a great chance to do so. So the girl immediately got up from her seat and started running away. The man, meanwhile, tried to stop her first with words, but when he realized that it was impossible, he ran after her. Ethiopia couldn't think of anything other than the fact that she could actually use magic. The girl had already run out into the corridor and was running through the cold castle, completely barefoot, but she didn't care. Of course, there wasn't even a carpet in this place, just bare stone steps on which it was very easy to slip. As she ran, she looked around and noticed that this place was very different from the castles in the holy city because everything around was empty and soulless. There was not even a single picture. Verbert's voice behind her asking, "Does she really want to go out in such clothes in a snowstorm?" "Keep running after the girl." He asked if she had gone crazy, and also said that there were many demonic beasts in this place that would happily eat her as soon as she was outside. However, Ethiopia insisted on her own. She continued to run and, glancing at him, said that it would be much safer than staying near him. As soon as the guy heard this, he was so surprised that he even stopped for a while and, thus, gave her a head start. Ethiopia, meanwhile, finally saw the entrance doors and immediately thought that she would finally be saved. But when she wanted to go down the stairs, she suddenly stopped in horror. The girl looked down and saw many people sitting there. Some were wounded, others were helping them. She didn't understand what was going on, but when she looked the other way, she saw many more bodies wrapped in a blanket. These people had been dead for a long time. After that, she heard a loud scream, and looking towards the corpses, she saw a woman holding a wounded child in her arms, who was minutes away from death. As she looked further and further, she saw people who had lost limbs and mothers who were hugging their children and trying to warm them. Ethiopia stood there and just looked at it all. She couldn't believe that it was really true. It was all so horrible that it made her shudder. At that moment, Zerbord came up to her from behind, finally being able to take her away, and said that he was glad to welcome her to the north, and that this was, after all, his territory. The man waved his hand, pointing to all those wounded and dead people, and said that now they could probably talk calmly and sort things out. When he saw her surprised expression, he explained that the city clinic couldn't treat them in time, and that was why he was now treating these soldiers in his mansion, so that they wouldn't die and could continue to fight the monsters. When he saw her tearful eyes, he suddenly laughed and asked, "Does she really feel sorry?" The man also asked her if she felt any regret at being married in such a place where only corpses lay. Ethiopia was silent for a moment and just looked at him. Then she turned around and continued to descend. Zerbert asked her again to stop and asked what she was planning to do anyway, since he hoped she wouldn't go outside. But the girl, without even turning to him, replied that even if it was a little, she would at least try to use healing magic for these people. When she heard nothing in response, she turned to him and told him to let her go back to the city after checking the wounded. Ethiopia looked him straight in the eye and said that she was not a spy. She just wanted to prepare the papers to annul this engagement, and she really wanted him to sign it so there would be no problems. Of course, the girl understood perfectly well that when she returned to the holy city, she would have nowhere to stay, because now everything was different. And it was for this very reason that Ethiopia was sent straight north, so that it would no longer bother anyone and interfere in various affairs. Of course, the girl understood and knew all this perfectly well. At that moment, she approached one of the wounded soldiers and asked if he had recovered yet. The guy, breathing heavily, said that he was fine. He explained that he still had some strength and health. It was not that weakened, so he would like her to treat the rest of the people. However, Ethiopia, sitting down next to him, asked if it was okay if she checked his wound again anyway, since perhaps they had missed something quite serious. While she was examining his wound, the man explained that he had been bitten by an ice monster, and the only option was to simply cut off his leg, because otherwise the infection would spread further. The girl did not answer this. At first she thought about the fact that the power of the demonic beast could be so strong that it could infect not only the leg, but the whole body, so it was necessary not to treat, but to get rid of it. Of course, the girl, hearing about this, was incredibly surprised. She did not think that everything could be so serious. However, she still decided to try to heal before cutting it off. At that moment, the man looked at her with distrust and decided to start a conversation. He asked if he had correctly assumed that she was not a local. When Ethiopia didn't respond and just continued doing her thing, he told her to stop, because it was completely useless. He knew that she was most likely not a local, and that was why she didn't know everything. However, at that moment, he looked at his knee again and was incredibly surprised because there was no longer a wound on it and it was completely healthy. He even screamed in surprise. The man asked how this could even be reality. Now he could move his leg, and this surprised him very much. He addressed the girl directly and said that it was simply incredible. She was able to somehow repair the wound from the demonic beast, and this amazed him. People who were nearby and heard this immediately began to come closer and asked, "Did she really do this? After all, they would also like to be cured?" Ethiopia, meanwhile, responded rather coldly that it had simply done the best it could, nothing more. Other people also ran up to her and asked her to heal their children or themselves. People wanted to have healthy limbs and, in principle, their entire body back. Ethiopia asked them to stand in line. She would definitely cure everyone. Then the first in line was a man with a damaged hand. He was also bitten by a demonic beast. When she actually succeeded in doing this, the people around her were just incredibly happy, especially when she treated children as well. Ethiopia herself was completely calm at that moment. She understood that if she did this, then in such moments she could ignore her reality a little, and this calmed her heart very much. At such moments she was incredibly strong, focused on the process, and did not think at all about what had happened to her in the past. The girl also understood that she could not tell them her true feelings, but at such moments she even felt some relief. The man, meanwhile, was carefully watching the girl's work, and Ethiopia, when she decided to take a little rest because she had used a lot of strength, suddenly heard the conversation of the girls who were standing nearby. One of them said that she was curious about what would happen if the daughter of the Kellett family came to this place. They wanted to know if she would be safe in such conditions, because they are quite harsh. And the third girl heard that she was even attacked by monsters during the trip. But she also said that the only one who survived that fight was her and one horse. As soon as Ethiopia heard this, she was in incredible shock. She couldn't believe that the driver, their escort, and most importantly, the maid, all died on the street due to monster attacks or the cold. Ethiopia even thought about how great it would be if she just died with them all. Now she wouldn't have so many problems to solve as quickly as possible. However, at that moment, a man approached her and said that she had rather strange tastes. In order to heal these exiles, she simply went and made all this way to this place. Ethiopia began to feel very ill. However, when she looked up, she saw Zerbert standing next to her, who had been watching her all this time as she treated all those people from the hospital. Ethiopia started a conversation with him and said that he had some strange tastes too, if he really thought they were exiled. But he still wouldn't open the gates of his castle to them. He made beds for all these poor and sick people on the doorstep, where it was still incredibly cold. After a long silence, she also said that some time ago she saw one. As soon as he heard this, he was immediately very surprised and laughing asked, "What kind of dream was that?" Ethiopia calmly replied that if there are people who need her and she can do something good for them where she finds her place, then of course she feels happy. However, she said that these were the kind of things where she was simply stating her opinion. He didn't have to agree with it or argue with it, she just needed to share it with someone. The man did feel a little uncomfortable about this. However, he said he wanted to know, did she come to this place just to heal her broken heart? Of course, he understood perfectly well that this was a little tactless, but he still continued to develop this topic and said that she received the answer in this place. Her wound cannot be healed simply by healing other people at the same time. He also said that he was very surprised and amazed by how selfish a woman she was. Of course, the man could not believe that she was treating all these people just because she thought she could cure herself. Ethiopia knew it was just awful, but she couldn't deny it. So she decided to change the subject a little and asked him why he thought he wanted to marry her. For a while they were both silent, and then Ethiopia asked, was he really paid some amount of money to do this? After all, she really. So I thought. Zerbert did not answer this. At first he only sighed heavily and adjusted his hair, and the girl, lowering her head, said that she would also like to know about these cruel things. She asked him if he was right in knowing that he had never been in love with her or anyone else, and that was the reason she wanted to know why he had decided to choose her as his wife. The wind in his at disposal could turn out to be any. As soon as the man heard these words, they made him very angry. He walked up to her very quickly and came right up to her face. The guy didn't say a single word, he just stood there and looked her straight in the eyes. Ethiopia felt uncomfortable about this, so she decided to defend herself and asked what was going on. But at that moment, he handed her a piece of paper and said that he had signed the annulment documents that she had asked him to, so he did not understand why she had suddenly decided to bombard him with claims. At that moment, two of Zerbert's assistants were on a break. One of them ran up to his friend and asked if he had seen the Demon King by chance, since he urgently needed to meet him. Kyra, who was calmly eating his sandwich, was very surprised and asked, is he really talking about the captain? After all, he did not understand why he called him so formally. Linus looked rather worried and asked who else besides him could be the Demon King. He also handed over the paper and said that he wanted to give it to him. As soon as the guy saw the piece of paper, he immediately realized that it was about the missing person. However, he pointed towards his boss and asked, wasn't he the one who was there? Linus came closer and actually saw the man the Demon King was looking for. He was standing next to the girl and he was in a panic. He couldn't believe it was really him. His friend, meanwhile, continued to eat his sandwiches and said that it was absolutely delicious. He was really enjoying his lunch just watching what was happening. His second assistant, who was carrying very important papers to him, even clenched them in his fist, not understanding how his master could flirt at all in such a serious situation. He had already forgotten that he wanted to come to him. And after that, he sighed heavily and said that, apparently, this woman really was that so-called bride. His partner said that it looked exactly like that, and added that quite a lot had happened. However, he was still glad that the girl was okay, because she really was in danger. However, now she was standing safe and sound next to the Demon King, and the boys thought that she had quite a lot of courage since she could even calmly talk to him. Linus thought about what an incredible woman she was, and if it were him, he would have died of fear in front of the Demon King himself. But she really behaved calmly. The guy suggested that she might be a real secret agent. After all, such people teach resist even the strongest opponents. The boy knew perfectly well that if the Demon King found out, she would be killed instantly. Meanwhile, the man continued to show Ethiopia his annulment papers, as she had requested. The girl just smiled. She took them in her hands, and she herself was very surprised that he so calmly agreed to break off the engagement. She did not expect that everything could go so smoothly and without problems. However, when she looked more closely at the document, she was very surprised, because there was a condition for annulling the engagement, and it was quite indecent. This condition turned out to be a kiss. The man, as soon as he saw her surprised expression, said that everything was correct. If she allowed him to kiss her, then she could calmly go to her homeland, and nothing would bind them anymore.